What is and you're not a theologian, you're not a biblical scholar, but you read the Bible and you believed it like me when you were young. My question is, what do you, based on everything you know now about the brain and psychology and understanding why we believe in things, what is the best explanation to you that fits what happened with the Jesus cult? Do you think they had a post-bereavement hallucination, somebody, or do you think Paul was a con man, or like, what's your guess? Because I know it's all... It's a guess. It's a guess.
Yes, it's a guess, right? Well, I think there's several factors at work here. I mean, Jesus is not the first person to rise from the dead, to come down from heaven as God and interact with humans. And so on, Bart Ehrman has an entire course on this, how in a book, a teaching company course and a book, How Jesus Became God. And it turns out in those times, in those Roman times, it was not uncommon for gods to come down and interact with humans, for humans to go to heaven and interact with gods, for gods to become part human, and vice versa, for humans to become partially God, and so on. There were just tons and tons of stories and characters in Roman mythology that people pretty much accepted as true, and that the Jesus story was not that unusual. I like to talk about what's his name, Apollonius of Tyana. Same thing, contemporary of Jesus, walked on water, raised the dead, and then was persecuted and then died and rose to heaven after his death. Okay. And of course Christians go, oh, well, that, they stole that from the Jesus story. Well, maybe, but it was contemporary. So
Ehrman doesn't,
and it wasn't all that accepted. It wasn't accepted until centuries later, and Christianity became the state religion of Rome. Well, so my point is that, first of all, it's not unusual for that story at that time, for people to just accept it. That was kind of in their cultural milieu. And then, yes, post-death bereavement, people who love somebody or is close to somebody who dies, they do have post-death apparitions. They see them more commonly. They hear their voice. That's not that unusual. There was studies on this show some non-trivial percentage, I forget what it is, but it's a 2-digit number, of people that have these kinds of experiences. So the harder thing to explain, I think, that takes some demographics and some statistical analysis, is how Christianity became so large. Mm-hmm. And so Ehrman has some calculations in his latest book. I forget the title of the book, but it's basically how Christianity became so huge.
Yeah, Triumph.
That's it. Triumph of Christianity. Yeah, that's it. You only need like a 1% growth rate. Just think of the economy. That doesn't sound like a lot, but over the course of decades and centuries, you can get many millions. And then when Constantine made Christianity the official state religion in the late 4th century, okay, that kind of sealed it. Early 4th century, sorry. And then, you get momentum built from there, and you end up with, a handful of major world religions. That's kind of how most things go, that most, you start off with a new industry like automobile manufacturing. There were hundreds of car makers in the early 20th century, and then we ended up with just a handful. That's kind of usually how it goes. We have a duopoly of most things, diaper manufacturers. There's just really two that make 99% of all the diapers. And this is true, these are power laws. 90% is accounted for by 10%, let's say. I was thinking about this recently with podcasts, like 10% of the podcasters have 90% of the money and audience, but it's even worse than that. It's probably more like 10, not 10%, 10 have 90% of the audience. But so if you think about that in the context of religion, you could have thousands of religions and gods and godlike human beings and so forth. And that eventually, this is kind of how markets move, including the market for religion. You end up with just a couple that account for 90% of humanity. And that's, of course, the 3 Abrahamic religions, and then Hinduism, Buddhism, a couple others that pretty much accounts for everything. So I think that accounts for that growth. Now, none of this has anything to do with any of this is true or not. That's a separate question. But arguing that, well, we have more numbers than they have doesn't work, because Christians, well, okay, there's 2 billion Christians, but there's, like 1.2 billion Muslims. All right, so what's the line that you go, okay, well, now it's true because we hit 1.5 billion. So, epistemologically, it doesn't even make any sense. And of course, Jews are tiny. There's like 16 million Jews in the whole world. It's nothing compared to Christians and Muslims. And yet, they believe that, that their particular doctrines. And in fact, they even accept that there will be a Messiah. They just don't think Jesus of Nazareth was it. And they even think it's possible to raise somebody from the dead. They just don't think Jesus was the one who rose from the dead. They just don't think that's the case. So I'm often fond of asking Christians, if your arguments are so good, if you think the evidence is so solid, why don't Jews and Muslims accept this? And you can't argue that, imams and rabbis don't understand the arguments. Of course, they understand the arguments. They know all the arguments. It's what they do for a living. They read all these arguments about these deep questions. So they just don't accept it, and there's never going to be a consensus because it's not, religious truths are not like empirical truths.
All I could say is never forget. I know that there's cognitive dissonance in the world. I experienced it. Dr. Shermer's experienced it, but we are Myth Vision.